Freedom, published in 1943, written by James Burnham. What does it mean to be Machiavelian?
Have you read this book, Keith?
I did. I got quotes and everything from it.
Yeah, it's a great. Yeah. It's a 20th century classic, and there are not a lot of 20th century classics, but especially in this genre. But when there are, and this is absolutely. James Burnham tends to be better known for The Managerial Revolution, which is a book that far more people have read. When I found a copy of the Machiavelians in a used bookstore, just randomly in a used bookstore in like 2005, you could still buy a copy online. By like 2012, you can no longer buy a copy online, and now it's been reprinted, so you can get copies online again. But it was a book that had vanished in a lot of ways for a lot of people, and that's because it simply fits. It just ruthlessly breaks you out of the mold of sort of the political conventions and illusions that you live in, and it says, okay, you are not alone in not understanding how you are ruled at all. You are not alone in being ruled by psychological means. Everyone throughout history has been ruled through psychological means. Let's understand how this works. The sources that it cites, has a couple of its own essays and a number of sort of treatments of sources. The most readable and best is probably Gaetano Mosca, who wrote around a little before 1900. His book is called, in English, it's called Theory of the Ruling Class, but in Italian, it's Elements of Political Science. Go figure. I would much rather call it Elements of Political Science, because I think in some ways Mosca is really the Darwin of political science, except that Darwin, was burned at the stake by the church. He wasn't burned at the stake, but clearly his perspective has not really, it's not sort of taught as, certainly not as current theory in today's political science departments. That the closest you'll get to what Burnham is talking about, the sort of the school of political scientists that Burnham is talking about is sometimes called the Italian school or the Italian elitist school of political science. They're from, you can't really call them fascists because they're from the generation before fascism. You can't really call someone a fascist when there was no such thing as fascism. And in general, you see sort of that trend and kind of the right wing or the opposition to the establishment sort of becomes more plebeian and kind of stupider as the 20th century goes on. And so, if you think of these people as right wingers, they're sort of more like the Sicilian aristocrat character in The Leopard, right? And they're Italians, of course, right? And so they have very good taste. And the closest thing, so some people in academia today study Carl Schmitt, who is, again, from a later generation, but, sort of a similar scholar. I like the Italians a little. Schmitt is very good. I like the Italians a little better because they're sort of more concrete and they kind of delve less into kind of murky Teutonic philosophy. They're very, very straightforward and down to earth. So, for example, one of the things, the essay that Burnham starts the Machiavelians with, which I believe is called Dante, Politics as Myth, is an absolutely just this searing and beautiful work, because you realize he's introducing this work of Dante, like not the some NFL cornerback, like the Dante you've heard of, and he's introducing Dante's work on political science called De Monarchia, in which basically Dante believes in takes a his Ghibelline argument. I think he was a Ghibelline, not a Guelph, and makes this argument for universal monarchy, right? He's and which is totally everyone forgets this work because it's not it's a work of fantastic political science. It's not the Inferno or the Paradiso, right? And so basically here comes Burnham, right? And he's basically describing this work of Dante's, and then he sort of narrates it and he's explaining, kind of paraphrasing Dante, and then you realize he's going to rip it to fucking shreds. This guy is basically taking on Dante, and he's and the way in which he's taking on Dante is so beautiful, because he says, okay, here's Dante. What is he actually saying? Well, what he's saying is just complete mumbo jumbo and makes no fucking sense at all. So why is he saying it? why he's saying it is because, and then Burnham goes into the real details of like the ugly ass political, like total Sopranos tier, like, you know, like political scene that Dante is embedded in, and just like all this just like ugly ass stuff, probably better than actually people knew it at the time. And so he's like, if you take this thing and you read it literally, it's a bunch of BS. But if you take it and read the subtext, what it's saying is that my guys should triumph and yours should be scattered to the winds, right? and that translation is sort of so effective. And then he sort of spends the rest of the book explaining how to translate that into the terms of your sort of current political universe that you're in at the time, and how to essentially, you know, it's very although you know, it's very easy to dispel, you know, the matrix that Dante was in, you know, 600 years later. You can red pill that all you want, right? But to basically look at the world you're in and basically like be like, what do I believe in unquestioningly? That's just obviously a bunch of ridiculous BS. You know, as Orwell said, you know, what's in front of your nose is the hardest to see. Understanding sort of power and how it works through that kind of completely realist Machiavellian eye is what you have to do. And this is why Burnham calls the book The Machiavelians Defenders of Freedom.
Now, I love how when talking about...
You're like, no, Machiavellians doesn't... Does that make sense? I lost you for a sec.
Yep. Yeah. And do you have me?
I have you.
Okay.
Your resolution's improved again.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think I interrupted you because I had stopped hearing anything on your end. So why does he call it the Machiavellians Defenders of Freedom?
He calls it the Machiavellians Defenders of Freedom because to defend the truth is to defend freedom. And, you know, essentially freedom of thought is of no importance at all and, in fact, harmful unless it's freedom to think the truth. But, you know, once you have you know, once that freedom to not just to think the truth, but to think in terms of the truth, because to think in terms of the truth, you know, I mean, this is speaking in truth, as you know, Solzhenitsyn calls it, like living in truth. Is essentially the same problem. And if you have to basically construct all of your mathematics around the theory that 2 + 2 is 5, you know, that's going to affect a lot more than 2 + 2 is 5. I mean, how often every day do you add 2 and 2, right? You know, you could go through it like just make it a social convention. You know, every time you buy 2 things and they're $2 each, it comes out to 5, right? You know, you can work around it, you know, but it starts to like get into like your theorems and stuff. Like, you know, like you have some pretty strange, you know, non-mathematics to basically to account for that. And that's why, you know, that's why that sort of equivalence is so important. And when you lose the ability to think, like you can lose anything else, right? I mean, you know, you can go all the way to various kinds of Jonestowns, and you know, we certainly have seen the two most catastrophic events in which society really Jonestowns itself are the French and Russian revolutions. We've seen very smaller versions of that, but you know, one couldn't help. Trump made this weird tweet recently where he's just like, I was just trying to stop the country from killing itself. And I was just like, that's a moment of just complete insanity or complete genius, and I cannot tell which. Of course, Burnham later writes a book, which is good, although maybe not as good, called The Suicide of the West. But, you know, the point of the Machiavelians is he's approaching, you know, that's a book that will feel inevitably somewhat dated because it's a book from the Cold War. And the Machiavelians is approaching, not only it's written in the middle of the war, when maybe even to some people the outcome still feels in doubt. And so it's written in a way that really transcends this post-war era that we live in. And that's one of the things that makes it, you know, you always feel that books written before 1940 have this kind of broader scope of ambition and sense than those written afterward. And this is kind of the sort of very late flower of that first half of the 20th century. So really, I would say it's, you know, my favorite introduction to political science. I can't think of a better one.
it's one of those where, like, on page 1, you're just hooked. He goes, let's start with the 1932 Democratic platform. And then you read it, and it's things like the government needs to... in short, the government needs to stop growing as fast as it is. It's getting out of control. He goes, what are we to make of these? And this is where he gets real meanings or real aims versus the formal meanings and the formal aims. In today, if you're watching politicians today or CNN, what are some of the major real meanings versus formal meanings?
An example I was just thinking about, and this is an example that all of your viewers will without question recognize and understand, is, let's take the strong interest in gun control of American progressives. Now, why are they so interested in fighting your Second Amendment rights? Is it because they're evil? No, absolutely not. It's because they're Machiavelians, and they understand being Machiavellian at a sort of deeper, there's kind of no conflict in their souls when it comes to thinking in a Machiavellian way. And so their hearts are thinking about this massacre or the other massacre or whatever massacres, the total of whose deaths add up to the number of people that fell off of ladders, this year, like considerably less, right? And so, if these people are motivated by, the actual, deaths of innocents caused by firearms, I mean, I think most of the people, it varies, but I think for most of the people using ladders, they're probably just as innocent. They probably made some bad choices, as did the people who were killed by guns, but not maybe. But many of the people who fell off ladders, completely innocent, right? And they're just, this thing destroys their life. They should have hired someone. Is it really that this is what is bothering these people, or really the cause there of this sort of intensification of their emotion, when we know perfectly well that they're very happy to drown out these emotions, if some ISIS terrorist runs someone over in a semi-truck, right? There the emotion must be suppressed. We must not, overreact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can take this story both ways. And why is it always taken in the direction that it's taken? What is the sort of fundamental energy there? Well, obviously, of course, the lib looks at all of these armed cons and is like, oh my God, there's like 67 Panzer divisions out there, and the only thing they're lacking is they can't buy any ammo right now, and otherwise we'll be swept into the sea. Moreover, they think that we think like them. And because they think that we think like them, they're like, any minute now they will get together and sweep us into the sea, because that's the sort of exactly what anyone who seriously cared about or understood power would do. And they seriously care about and understand power. And the idea that their enemies actually, supposed enemies actually don't, and they don't really have enemies, they just have victims, is not one that fits within their brains, right? And so, that is essentially the sort of the source of the political energy that causes them to want to ban your AR-15 is, of course, the desire to, disarm this incipient army out there, and not, the ostensible goal of preventing the next school shooting. Now, that's not to say that school shootings aren't sad. They're very sad, but they don't really, they wouldn't even be a blip on the radar if it were not for this basically emotional political cause.
I think it's page 45, he discusses two types of political men, the ruler type and the ruled type. The outstanding aspect of the majority is its political passivity. The ruler type characteristics consists of ambition, fraud, and ability to adapt to the times, continuing on page 66, saying it is through these, religion is essential to the well-being of the state. So, are those two connected, or am I just connecting them in my head? And what are your thoughts on those?
I would explain these things maybe in a slightly different sense. First of all, there's no question that not only do most people, like the circle of people who are actually in the loop. There's a nice Armando Iannucci film called In the Loop. The set of people who are actually in the loop in any oligarchical system is much smaller than the set of people who feel in the loop, because you might have noticed that a lot of people interact with politics in a very similar way to their interaction with professional sports, except that of course they have absolutely no skin in the game in professional sports, and they have absolutely no power over, quote unquote, their team, right? And yet, their brains are stimulated in the same way. So in a sense, the feeling of being important has the same relationship to actual importance in this case, I would argue, that pornography has to sex, right? Because you're essentially stimulating the feeling of power without actually generating any power, which is an essential kind of component in, if you're basically, and it has sort of the same effect as pornography, which is that it decreases the amount of sex in the world, because you're actually, when you convince people to sort of bite on the hook of something that appears to be power and is not really power, then, nothing happens. And you've basically taken away their power in a very beautiful form, because you've taken away their power by convincing them that they actually have power. Very smooth move. The more you sort of learn about how these Jedi mind tricks work, the more you have to admire them, right? And it's not like anyone really, there's no central control here. No one designed this stuff. It's just beautiful. It's a piece of nature. And so when you look at essentially the set of people who actually matter, they're the set of people who, number one, can flourish in an oligarchy, which is hard. Ask anyone who's ever gotten a PhD and tried to be a professor. Not so easy, not so fun, really nasty, sharp-elbowed environment, and there's a lot, the jobs suck, and there's a lot more people who want them than can get them, which is often just a really nasty combination. When you look at what it takes to get into the loop, it takes a lot of talent and a lot of energy, and just, your soul is sort of worn away along the way. And so you get this sort of government where, do you know the film Election with Matthew Broderick? Classic 90s film. It has this character named Tracy Flick, who's like the class president type, right? She's the high school class president type. These people. They're horrible, but are they talented? Are they energetic? Yes, they are. And so you're basically selecting for this really, really wrong worldview of governing in those people, and that comes, the sort of the kind of the end of that point is when you restrict it to the actual people who hold power and the ways in which they hold power. There's something else Burnham mentions in the book, which he takes from Vilfredo Pareto, who's also an Italian political scientist, although I like to think of these guys as gangsters. Especially Gaetano, Jimmy the Fly Mosca. Mosca means fly. So Pareto comes up with this, what he calls the theories of residues. And he's like, when you look at the people who actually exercise power, there's basically two kinds. There's lions and there's foxes. And the lions are essentially figures of authority, and the foxes are, sort of think of exercising power through authority, and the foxes think of exercising power through subversion and influence. And so, when you had sort of Christendom was divided between the Pope and the Emperor sort of vying for power, naturally, the Pope, not that he didn't have his armies and shit, but, the Pope relies more on influence, right? He's sort of more of a religious figure. Or, there's this great writer, Donoso Cortés, who was a parliamentarian in Spain in the 1840s. And he has this famous line that society is controlled in one of two ways. He's like, there are two thermometers. There's the thermometer of authority and the thermometer of religion. And as one of these rises, the other must fall. And as one of these falls, the other must rise, right? And so, what you're seeing there is you're seeing this situation in which the United States is largely governed by religion. It needs sort of very little energy there because the population is sort of so weakened that it can't. Like, one of the reasons why democracy was not considered a viable option for most of history was that you simply didn't have the requisite popular energy. You couldn't go out and ask the population of France in 1650 to go and vote on what the budget of France should be, or whether it should go to war with the Prince of Saxony or something, right? These people don't know one thing, and that's grapes, right? And it's just a ridiculous exercise. You might as well do what the Romans did and ask the chickens. Somehow you could always persuade the chickens to get the right result. There's like an art of handling chickens, right? And there's an art of handling peasants too, but it's a ridiculous art. And so you sort of need this kind of public energy and this public confidence of virtue. One of the things that Burnham will tell you, not that Burnham invents this, of course, is that essentially one of the necessary ingredients in a ruling elite is just that it has the confidence to govern and that it believes it has the right to rule. One of the reasons why you see sort of bourgeois democracies replace sort of aristocratic monarchies in the sort of waning of the pre-modern era is that those kings no longer believed they had the right to rule. I mean, Louis XVI was like, absolutely, let's do the modern thing. I'll be a constitutional monarchy like Britain, and that, I mean, and Nicholas II, has sort of the same thing. He loses his confidence. He doesn't really believe he has the right to rule. And so, in a sense, when you go out and you look at America and the Tea Parties and the proletariats and the MAGAs and, sort of all these people, you're not really seeing people that have the confidence that they have the right to, that actually, someone was like, oh, we're down in the Georgia Capitol. Why don't we storm the Capitol and take over Georgia? And I'm like, motherfucker, if you took over it, what would you do with it, right? You have no fucking idea, and you'd be the dog that caught the car. And so who's going to support you in that, right? Who wants to be a dog with his teeth in the bumper of a car? That's all you would be. And that's why that's not a non-starter, because the idea of a state seceding or whatever the fuck in the 21st century is ridiculous. It's a perfectly sensible idea, but you have to be going somewhere. And that's how that could happen to the Soviet Union. They were going somewhere, but you're not going anywhere. And so seeing essentially things, for example, the reason why you see the weakness of Trump is sort of the weakness of the forces behind him, which actually, contrary to popular belief, did not include any sort of stormtroopers and had no, preparations for a KKK militia coup or anything like that. They were just a bunch of, people watching TV. I mean, one example I like to give is, it's like, well, Trump has 75 million supporters. Okay, well, what are those people willing to do? The 75 million. Suppose he asks 75 million people to install an app on their phone. How many do you think you could get to do it? 5 million? 10 million? Like, that's how much people care, right? It's a very, very low engagement situation. And how many people do you think Biden could get to install an app on their phone, right? I mean, with all respect to old China Joe, he's not the man he once was, and the he's not watching that Trans Am anymore, so you're seeing these systems that run on very low energy and very low engagement, and what it reminds you of again is like there's essentially two sort of schools of realistic thought about the modern world. One of them believes, both of them understand that America is Rome. But the real question is, are we looking at the end of the Roman Republic or the end of the Roman Empire? So you kind of are seeing sort of elements of both, right? and they're different in different ways. And certainly we'd much rather be looking at the late Roman Republic. How late it is, we don't know. But let's just go with that. History doesn't repeat, it only rhymes. But, let's say it's the late Republic. Well, one of the things we see in the late Republic, comparable to sort of the decline of popular energy today, that is also something that happens to Roman democracy. And that's why essentially Roman democracy reduces to this sort of battle between these factional warlords, is that these are the people who basically learned to kind of industrialize the production of political power and have run up huge debts doing it. And the most interesting thing is that actually two things happen after the Roman Republic falls. One of them is that the Roman Republic doesn't fall. No one believes the Republic has fallen. Augustus is like, I've restored the Senate, I've restored the Republic, I've fixed everything, everything is cool again, no more civil wars, thanks to me, the first citizen, right? The word prince comes from Augustus's principe, which means first citizen. So he's like, I'm just, Rome needed helping out. I've helped out. I'm here. I'm helping out. Helping with the Senate. Good guys, Senate. Love those guys. And that was Augustus's perspective. And then, Tiberius, when he takes office, basically, he was Augustus's stepson. By no means as talented character as Augustus takes office. He's like, okay, Augustus saved the Republic. He really meant it. I really mean it. I really, really mean it. So, okay, Senate. It's all up to you guys now, Senate. And the Senate is like, great, it's wonderful, what should we do, Tiberius, right? And that's even the Senate, right? These are big guys, these are VIPs, right? And of course in Rome they used to have actual popular elections, and the last guy who actually tries to hold a public, popular, old Roman Republic style election in Rome is actually a historian who would have called, or an emperor who would have called himself Gaius Caesar, but who we know as Caligula. Now, set aside the Penthouse movie here. This is a real guy, but basically Caligula holds this election and it's like a joke, right? Because no one cares and it's not serious and it's just dead. And, the thing is, how is California not headed to that point? Like elections, and, when I moved to San Francisco in the 1990s, there were still competitive Democratic versus Republican, right versus elect mayoral elections in that city. There were, for another 10, 15 years, there were competitive elections for the government in Sacramento. That's all gone, right? And so you kind of see that this sort of phase in which you could take these positions seriously and not be just like, oh, the power in America belongs to the bureaucracy, and much of that is not even the bureaucracy within the deep state, but in fact outside the government in educational and press and other para-governmental structures. You're looking at so that that's sort of the reality that Burnham would want you to notice. And I think, one of the things, since I'm certainly not blaming this on myself, but one of the things I've noticed over thinking about these things over the last, I started writing my blog in 2007, and at that time, the idea that there was another reality under our political reality, or that our political reality was just in some ways an empty form, was essentially unheard of. And today, essentially everyone is familiar with this Turkish loanword, the deep state, which is not one that I ever used, but which basically covers the matter very succinctly and very well. In fact, there's there was this video of this Chinese professor that Tucker Carlson featured recently. There's another video of him floating around where he takes he's like the professor of foreign relations at the exclusive university for higher party cadres in China. So this is the Chinese person who knows the most about America. And there's a clip somewhere on YouTube where he delivers essentially his 2-minute summary of American politics, which is basically the same as mine. And which I'm pretty sure there's been no actual contact there, but we're just looking at the same fucking thing, right? And that's the thing. When misinformation spreads, it sort of leaves a trail, because it's like, how would they think of that? But when information spreads, it's just like, maybe he just looked at it, right? And so that sort of information is sort of breaking open in a way, and that's a very interesting effect, which I think will be much more durable than whatever the Trump administration wrote in water, or a half-finished fence or something, which is basically the largest effect of the Trump administration that I've seen. Can I tell you a funny story? Which is not related to James Burnham, it's sort of related to James Burnham, because essentially people live within this political forum, right? And they take the forum seriously. And the people who take the forum most seriously, without exception, are going to be children. So, when Trump was elected, my political strategy with my children, which is sort of breaking down a little, is that I don't talk to them about politics. And as far as they know, that I have no interest in politics. And best way to raise children by far. Depends on the child, of course. And in any case, but Trump is elected, and, all the adults basically are they're packing their suitcases to be shipped to the camps, right? They're going to tell us we can bring our suitcases, all our fillings will be melted down, and but let us bring the suitcases just in case, right? This is the way libs in San Francisco are thinking about Trump was just elected, right? And so, of course, they project this into their children, and of course, their children talk to our children, right? And so our children, they're very. I certainly heard Trump is going to kill all the Muslims, right? And I come home and I talk to my son, who is 6 at the time, and and he, to my amazement, has a very, very concrete concern about the election of Trump. It's a somewhat self-centered concern, but I mean, he's 6. He's allowed to be a little self-centered about this impending Holocaust or whatever. And he's like, Mom, how are we going to go to the beach? I'm like, what? He's like, Pop, how are we? I'm like, Henry, I heard you the first time. You're not making any sense. What do you mean? How are we going to be able to go to the beach? He's like, Pop. Now he's convinced that I'm just a complete idiot, right? He's like, Pop, if Trump builds a wall around the country, how are we going to be able to go to the beach? And I'm like, actually, the logic here is very strong, right? I'm like, okay, Henry, here's how it is. I'm like, and it sort of broke my rule, and I was like, if you, with your own eyes, see anything happen to this country that would have happened differently if Mrs. Clinton had been elected, I'll be surprised. Now, I think a lot of the COVID stuff would have gone differently if Mrs. Clinton had been elected. Some for better, some for worse. Would have been a totally different scene. But that's an emergency. That's sort of an exception to the normal running of the U.S. government. The fact is, 99% of people who actually work in government or power of any kind had their existences not changed at all by they had the picture in the embassy changed, right? Literally that's what changes. And so, you're not doing very much when you elect this. And the fact that you get so excited over not doing very much is itself an indicator of the very small amount of not only power, but also virtue that you have. Because, and I mean virtue very much in the Latin sense, virtus of virtue. It's just like, if you're actually Trumpists who are like, when we vote for the GOP, we're voting for cucks, should sort of take a look at themselves and be like, well, how exactly was it that you were so easily cucked? Right? Because the thing is, if it turns out that it's so easy to cuck you as it is, maybe you should rethink your marriage. Maybe you should rethink basically your relationship with power. And maybe in particular, when you think about power, you're thinking, how should we behave like the Tea Party? Well, the original Tea Party. Well, the original Tea Party is basically, number one, it's basically Antifa. Number two, it's basically Antifa. And when you look at Antifa, these are people whose lives are probably pretty empty and to whom politics means a whole lot. When I look at you, or at least who you want to be, Mr. Trump supporter, you're like, you have a small business, you have a life, you have a mortgage or whatever, and your lack of engagement, your low engagement in the system is actually rather logical. And so what you really want in a political system is basically, how can I, by doing a very small amount of work in a very sort of coherent and sensible way, in a sane way, have a very large effect on the government on a one-time basis. And that's a completely different question than the sort of completely phony GOP is answering. And I think you're seeing a lot of grassroots Republicans out there basically realizing that their political party is shit in a silk stocking, to quote Napoleon, and they of course have no alternative to this shit in a silk stocking, but they should ask themselves just simply, where are you and how did you get here, right? Because everything that they're doing sort of has a tendency to get them deeper in, and that's sort of the situation that you're in when you're in anything like a trap. You basically should take for granted that the direction that you want to push forward is not a useful direction, because if it was a useful direction, it wouldn't be a trap, and you're clearly in some kind of a trap. And I think that's that kind of thinking will go on for Republicans and Libertarians. I don't want to congratulate everyone who voted for Joe Jorgensen out there on electing our President-elect Biden, or as only his close friends know him, China Joe. And in any case, you'll have 4 years of this animated personality, or maybe animatronic personality, on television, and life's going to be good. And the other thing that you should think about, probably most of your regular viewers, Keith, were probably not Biden voters. I'm going to take a wild guess at that. I think that those of you who didn't vote for Biden, should really think again, because, when I think about politics in a Machiavelian sense, to tie this back to where we're coming from, what is the purpose of politics? The purpose of politics is to reward my friends and punish my enemies. And if what you're doing politically as a collective action is rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies, it is in some sense working. However, if the effect is rather to punish your friends and reward your enemies, what you're doing is probably not working. And when I look at basically the effect of the Trump administration, I see that the Trump administration, very literally in the form of the Department of Justice, basically spent 4 years punishing Trump's friends. I notice also that, sort of everyone who is friendly with this movement or with this power has basically had the full force of the powers that be directed at them, often to very devastating effect. And so I'm like, well, has the system punished my friends? Has this effort wound up punishing my friends? Certainly it has. Has it wound up rewarding my enemies? Well, has it increased the revenue of the New York? Well, actually, it's doubled the revenue of the New York Times. Moreover, even more, when you look at the press, what you see is that they've turned their energy up to this enormous level because they've basically convinced everyone that they were fighting off Hitler. Well, Hitler turned out to be pretty easy to fight off in the end. Kind of makes you think. But more importantly, you had this media environment where for 4 years, basically, some middle school teacher in Bloomington, Indiana, could feel like she was a member of the French Resistance, right? On her Facebook moms group, right? The Facebook moms, they're prepared to to smuggle any downed Allied flyers that may come down in their neighborhood. They're preparing the Resistance Watch. Maybe they'll sabotage a train, it's very exciting, right? And even though, none of these activities really take place in real life, if you ask a lot of these ladies, would you derail, a train to stop Trump? Suppose it was bringing the Proud Boys, to the Trump coup. Would you throw your bricks upon the tracks? Would you throw your bodies on the tracks? Yes, they would. Maybe, I don't know. But would they say they would? They would say they would, right? And so, this is a level of this is like taking this piece of your brain which says, I matter, I'm important. You go to college and, in order to get into college, you write an essay saying, I matter, I'm important, I want to make an impact, I want to change the world, right? Here are all these people who wrote these same college essays. They're out there, they're being real estate agents or whatever, environmental, mitigation all kinds of tech writing, all kinds of very banal careers, and then here is this thing that offers them just this chance to matter or to feel important in a way that they've never felt in their lives. And so it's like, basically it's like, did reading the New York Times, New Yorker, or whatever, worrying about the Koch brothers, worrying about George W. Bush even, did that make them feel like they mattered? Yes, it did. But it was beer. Okay, they were drinking beer. It was just beer, right? And suddenly their beer has been replaced with crack-flavored malt liquor, right? and they're enjoying it, right? Suddenly life was in black and white. Maybe it wasn't in black and white, but the saturation was not high, right? And then suddenly they're like living life in like flaming 4K HDR, like everything is on, everything is live, everything is big, right? And then we're fighting off Trump, and then there's this sort of orgasmic, although it's kind of a slow word, there's this orgasmic moment where they prevail and they've defeated Trump, right? And that's like this pinnacle moment. They come into the streets, they're like, it wasn't even nearly as much joy as you saw when electing Obama, because frankly most of their dopamine system is already completely burned out, right? But that same system is now going to have to be stimulated by President Joseph R. China Joe Brezhnev and Vice President Metermaid, right? And so you're basically looking at a situation where the level of kind of charisma here is very, very low, and the level of nobody's like Biden the light worker, that's not a thing. And he's visibly not as young as he once was, and it's just a complete shit show. And then moreover, the ideology is like the novelty is wearing off. I talked to someone who'd actually been involved in a small way in the Nike Colin Kaepernick campaign. And he was like, yeah, the guys behind the Colin Kaepernick campaign have been trying to do that for a couple of years. And I was like, wow, if they'd done that a couple of years earlier, that would have been amazingly fresh. That would have been delightful, right? And when it came out, it was solid advertising. It was good praxis. It was fresh, right? But is it growing stale? Yeah, I think it's getting a little stale, right? And so you have this whole system that got turned up to 11 to fight back against Donald Trump. And it got turned up, and it got staffed up to 11. It got funded up to 11. It turned the volume up to 11. It was shrieking at 11. It got used to being on 11. And now, after January 20th, after he finally concedes and maybe gets banned from Twitter and arrested and, God only knows what, of course, many libs out there are like, I hope he gets raped in prison, and I saw this one great tweet which was actually a completely sincere tweet, this was not ironic at all. Like, I looked at the Twitter feed. This was not ironic. And the tweet says, actually, a powerful male rapist like Trump would be more likely to be doing the raping, right? and we know that, of course, somebody's doing the raping, right? So wherever that happens, right, the continuing travails of the Trump family, may bring a little bit of drama, but you basically have just this massive loss of entertainment. And so you ask, how are my enemies doing? My enemies are driving straight at a fucking brick wall, right? And so that's, how is that not a reason to be pro-Biden, right? And so, that's just moreover, the thing about having a supporter of the deep state in the White House is that you lost this pretense that things are not as they are. Instead, it's very, very clear, that when you look at President Brezhnev, you're looking at the aging face of an aging regime, right? It's just like death is written all over its cheekbones, and that's a beautiful thing because, that's sort of done more for truth than Trump could ever do. Let's see what he can declassify, but my guess is he's probably still going through channels to do that. Nothing will ever happen because he went through channels for everything all the time, and because he's I wouldn't say anything bad about Trump, but but yeah, I mean, like they're screwed. I wouldn't say they're screwed, but it's a very ugly situation to be in. And then you have this whole censorship, mechanism that's wound up, and you're going to find that basically mocking the president or the vice president is sort of going to be treated as hate speech in this bizarre way. Right, or certainly the president's wife. My God, Dr. Jill. And so you're already seeing that ramp up, and that in turn, first of all, that's just so resonant of just like ridiculous little totalitarian despotisms of the past. Secondly, that's being inflicted. This whole treatment is being inflicted on a generation of Americans who, if they were literate at all, grew up reading YA dystopian fiction, right? They grew up on a steady diet of the Hunger Games and shit like that. And so basically when they see people behaving in a dystopian manner, it is extremely recognizable to them. And that you're definitely going to see more and more in Gen Z in the Biden administration. It may be that the millennials just all have to be put on rafts, but the in Gen Z, people say this about the Eskimos, but what they don't, what you never hear about is when the old people put the young people on the rafts. I'd say as a proud Gen Xer, but I'm very into generational nationalism, and for you. All right. Any further questions? Anyway,
so
field here.
My two favorite things in the book, page 121, how myths arise the masses, things like general strikes, the end of the world, Marxist revolution, and then page 166, the iron law of oligarchy, also known as the inevitability of oligarchy, where he uses the union meeting as an example. Do you want to comment on either of those?
I think we've said enough about, let me comment sort of briefly on both, because the interesting question in the second is if you're imagining any different form of government, and I think it should be very clear that anyone looking at sort of Western governance today, should realize that you can't imagine a different government without imagining a different form of government. You can't change the system incrementally in any useful direction. And so when you're imagining this different form of government, of course, being, uplifting and good-hearted, person, a light Machiavelian rather than a dark Machiavelian, you're like, of course I want this government to be based on the truth. I would like its political formula to be exact. I would like its political formula, which is basically the term for kind of the myth that makes you believe in the government. Political formula, it's a Mosca term. And, the example would be, let's say you're a peasant in ancient Egypt. Why should you obey the pharaoh? You obey the pharaoh because he's the son of the sun. And, if the pharaoh is displeased, the sun god is displeased, and maybe he'll make the sun go out and you'll freeze and die in the dark. Right. And that's why you should obey the pharaoh. And then in the modern world, we get into these kind of democratic political formula where you should obey the government because the government is actually you and you actually have power over it. You're using that political formula every time you use the word "we" to talk about the government, right? And which I see even libertarians do a lot. So the question is, if you're imagining a different form of government, you have to imagine a political formula for it. You have to imagine a way in which it is believed in that way. Hopefully, is a truthful way that doesn't involve any kind of fake Egyptian astronomy, but also is a way that basically is actually inspiring in the way sort of works with human emotion in the way that a political formula must. And that's a very interesting and, of course, completely open-ended question that depends on your answer to what's next, right? The second, wait, what was the second question again?
And then the second one was page 172, where I forget if it's Pareto, but he talks about the iron law of oligarchy.
Robert Mitchell's is the iron law of our oligarchy, right? And so, what the iron law of oligarchy tells you is that whenever you construct essentially a political arena in which you intend the actual political influence of every player in this large arena to be equal, it will inevitably become unequal in practice. And it will become extremely unequal in practice, and it will always result in a ruling minority and a ruled majority, which is completely contrary to, of course, all democratic theory of, so what Mitchell says is whenever you're looking at majority rule, you're actually looking at minority rule. And when you look at essentially, again, you have this just vastly increased awareness of, the American ruling class. I think the leftists today call it the professional mercantile class, but it's the upper college educated class, essentially. You're looking at these people, they're clearly a minority. They're in a considerable minority. It's like there was a great survey that was done, recently, where someone went around and with the greatest sensitivity asked this very disturbing question. They said, well, is there sometimes too much political correctness in this country? And anyone who is sort of willing to say yes is basically someone who has looked at this thing and found that it does not taste good at a certain level, right? And how many of the people said yes? About 80%, right? So you're essentially being ruled by, this minority of 20%, and they are the best, smartest, best educated people in the country. That's just a reality. And yet their heads are the most fucked. And that fact that this is actually America's, literally nobility. I would call them a nobility. It's like one of the things I say that always seems to make a deep impression is, have you ever been to Burning Man? You know of Burning Man, though. What you'll notice if you go to Burning Man is that it's a gathering of nobles. And, I think if you took a 17th century noble to Burning Man and looked at these people, even in their very poorly dressed states that they are, you would be like, yeah, you got a bunch of nobles here, right? And that's a realization, that that class stratification, even if you don't define it as existing, still exists. Burning Man, of course, struggles horribly with their demographics as well, because they basically have the demographics of a Klan rally. And that's not because anyone there is a racist. There are probably no racists there. Maybe there are 3, maybe as many as 5, right? But here is this thing with the demographics of a Klan rally. What's up with that, right? And so when you recognize that basically sort of the American nobility or the gentry in a sort of an English sense, that's a better word, really, the gentry exists and rules, and certainly anyone who's been around Ivy League universities realizes how they regard the rest of the country. You're completely outside of the idea of believing that sort of the concept of democracy is even possible. It's like, here's a way, and maybe we should close on this. Here's a way that you can think about this question. Create a political quadrant. And in your political quadrant, basically define, one axis is the country a democracy? And the other axis is, should it be a democracy? Right? And the set of people who agree with me that it isn't and it shouldn't be is almost zero. It's almost completely empty, right? So clearly, if you're creating a trap of any kind, the best place to hide the truth is a quadrant that's almost completely empty, and that actually almost seems to make no sense when most people think about it. But it actually does make a considerable amount of sense, because it's not a democracy because it's an oligarchy, and it shouldn't be a democracy because it should be a monarchy. And in fact, when you look at the 3 kinds of politics, and this is something that don't even have to go to the Italian elitist school for this. This is like straight up Plato and Aristotle. One of the things that you see is that, okay, there's essentially only 3 forms of government. There's rule by the one, the few, and the many: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, right? And these are really forces, not so much systems of government as forces of government. And the reason why we're in an oligarchy today is that, first of all, monarchical force is non-existent unless you have a monarch. You could certainly exercise it through the office of the president, but you'd have to have a real king in there. And he would have to, basically perform an auto coup. And democratic force is very, very weak. The public is, as we've discussed, very, very weak. And so, it's sort of natural that oligarchy, sort of rules. But when one of the other sort of ideas from classical political science is this idea that's called anakyklosis, which is that there's actually a cycle of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And that cycle sort of naturally recurs. It can actually go and, my theory, which is sort of an elaboration of the old theory, is that it can go in either direction, and it goes in different directions in rising and declining societies. And in declining societies, as in the declining Roman Republic, essentially what you realize is that oligarchy can only be displaced by monarchy. So when you're essentially believing, okay, here's this oligarchy, here's this deep state, here's this cathedral, here are these bad things, right, which are obstruction. Not run by the Sanhedrin of the international Jewish conspiracy, right? There's no institution that if you could make it disappear, or secret, that if you could make it disappear, go away or even be harmed whatsoever. It's a really fully distributed system, and it's completely in which you say, okay, this should be replaced by democracy, like the part of the quadrant where you're like, this isn't a democracy and it should be, which is like the classic American dissident quadrant. You're basically like, you have to construct a theory under which all of these MAGA Tea Partiers, whatever out there, can continuously overcome the will of educated NPR listening America. Totally, as a refugee, as a Coriolanus refugee from NPR speaking America, I'm like, not even a fucking chance, right? And your orders of magnitude of having a chance of just showing up to continuously keep your foot on the deep state's neck. And the only alternative that you have from that is to take all of your power and, instead of trying to exercise it directly, focus it into the lens of a monarch. And this is what always existed in the whole monarchical world. It was always an alliance of the monarch and the commons against the nobles. And the monarch was a mechanism that allowed the commons to essentially be a laser rather than a flashlight and focus their power by delegating it to one individual. Instead, one of the things you have in the commons today is they're very much, it's like, the Oath Keepers. Are you familiar with the Oath Keepers? The Oath Keepers out there. God bless you all, your Oath Keepers out there. I love you. I think you're somewhat misguided. But it's okay. It's not that you're a bad person. And the Oath Keeper, approach is very much, it's like we're the Minutemen. We're fighting back by being sort of decentralized power against centralized power. So we'll refuse American Politburo's demand to go door to door and confiscate guns or whatever, right? Fine, except that's not how things actually work. And what as an Oath Keeper you're constantly accused of being is you're accused of being the secret militia for Trumpists, right? You're the nascent Trump militia, and he'll send out a tweet on the emergency broadcasting system, and he'll be like, Oath Keepers, stand ready and stand by, or whatever the hell, and suddenly our streets will be overrun by take over the TV stations or whatever. It's complete fantasy, and it's not a fantasy that Oath Keepers believe in at all, is the irony. They're accused of actually being this kind of covert power mechanism, which they don't believe in at all. And actually, the idea of we're going to form the Oath Keeper Death Squad or whatever stupid ass shit is completely beyond, right? And thank God for that, and let's hope it stays that way, because they're not even capable of it, right? And definitely don't try anything like that if you're not going to win. And if you were going to win, you wouldn't need it. And so the thing is that actually the whole trend of their thinking is basically toward democracy and away from what they imagine as a much more monarchical system than it actually is, right? So because they're sort of LARPing the American Revolution, which is, at least on its surface, this anti-monarchical thing. So the thing is, if you think of democracy, monarchy, and oligarchy as rock, paper, scissors, what you're basically seeing is basically a bunch of people trying over and over and over again to beat paper with rock because they think it's actually scissors. And I'm like, no, actually, like, you need to put down your rock. Nice rock. Great rock. I love your rock. You know, wonderful rock. You need to put down your rock and figure out if there's anything around that you can make into a pair of scissors. Because my diagnosis is here is that you've definitely got some motherfucking paper to cut. You know, and you know, that's like a classic, you know, that's a basic Machiavelian way of thinking about that problem. Of course, when you think about that and you're like, what does that mean in the modern world? How is this different from classic monarchy? Totally fucking different. How is it different from 20th century fascism? Still quite different, but not as different because you're in a closer century. You know, what are you actually doing here? Of course, once you basically, while your plans are still in the realms of fantasy and while you're still basically being an oath keeper and, like, you know, organizing against a fantasy enemy that doesn't actually exist, you know, one of the signs that you're planning in the fantasy world is that your plans always remain very, very abstract, because your enemy is not actually real. Once you're composed with, oh my God, well, maybe the secret is we just have to give up on the beautiful American form of government, which is actually, you know, a shitty form of government in order to save our country, which is an amazing, beautiful, wonderful country. And you're like, wait, Washington, America, which one do I like? Which one do I not like, right? You know, and you're like, okay, and then you're like, well, maybe this crazy person is right. And, you know, the only way to save this system is some kind of a monarchy. But what would that even involve? What would that look like? Who would this person be? What would he do? How does that even make sense in the 21st century? And suddenly you have a lot of unanswered questions. And they're concrete questions. They're very hard questions. You're like, literally, you know, the question of you know, the book that I came on here to pimp, which I'm writing, serializing on Substack, is essentially the answers to the questions of, like, what would you actually do if you were in charge of this country and your authority was unlimited and you actually knew what you were doing and you had the best possible intentions? What would you even do? Forgetting on whether it's a good idea to have this setup, like, and, you know, even to ask that question leaves you starting to think in completely different ways about the problem of government in the 21st century, because you're basically used to the question of how should we change this system in the ways that we can actually change it. And I'm just like, who cares? Because you can't actually change it in any way that actually is meaningful or makes sense or matters at all. I mean, my God, the Reagan Revolution was 10 times, 150 times, let's say, as organized as the Trump Revolution. You know, it actually reduced the size of government. People were fired, you know, but 20 years later, it might as well have never have happened, right? And so, and, you know, those people those were amazing people. They were incredibly well organized. The American, either AEI or Heritage, I forget which, before Reagan came into office, wrote this like 600-page book on how to reform the government from like top to bottom, detailed everything. Like much of this, well, they actually tried to implement it, you know, it was all written water, right? You know, the thing is that you know, and even that was this very small relative plan that actually didn't really mean anything. But if you're actually thinking in terms of the question as I just posed it, there's actually a huge space for creative thought. Now, is this thought realistic? Well, you know, it's completely not realistic if there's no regime change, I'll tell you that. I'll also tell you that in 1985 in the Soviet Union, absolutely nobody was thinking about post-Soviet Russia. And in fact, when you had a post-Soviet Russia, they had a serious problem because nobody had fucking thought about it, right? You know, so they basically put in these fucks from Harvard who fucked it all up. And you would hope to avoid a situation like that, especially because here you have this very sour, you know, regime that people are really extremely sick of, and you don't have the sort of canned, obvious alternative of the West out there. The West doesn't have a West, right? And so, you know, actually thinking about these kinds of questions, I think, you know, it's both sort of potentially, it's either extremely fruitful or completely fruitless. It's one of these binary outcome, you know, kinds of things. And it's just like, it's, you know, very good exercise. You know, want to think about that instead of being a trekker, you know. And so that, and there's a third factor that makes it sort of reasonable to think about also, which is the fact that it is very true from a perspective of democracy that American sort of virtue and maybe even intelligence and certainly education has been declining. But there's actually one thing among Americans and modern people in general which has been expanding, and one sort of popular capacity which has been increasing, which is imagination. And so when you look, for example, when you go back and you look at World War I or World War II propaganda, like look at the original, like, you know, what you'll see is basically World War I propaganda. It's not movies yet, but, you know, it's sort of very simple. It's like the Hun is coming to rape your sister. Defend your sister against the Hun, right? And this is why you should die in a fucking trench somewhere, right? And you know, but it's
this
for
is babies on bayonets, yeah.
Yeah, babies on bayonets, right? You get to World War II, and first of all, of course, as you may know, atrocity propaganda is not actually really used in World War II. It's instead, you know, the Nazis are coming to take over the world, which is completely false. Actually, they were committing the same kinds of atrocities they were accused of in World War I, right? But didn't commit in World War I, right? But they did commit them in World War II, right? So, you know, but Hitler actually has no plan at all to take over the world. Maybe he would have had one. I don't know. But he didn't have one, right? So the actual story of the war is completely false, you know, but of course it's been retconned into something which is Nazi atrocities, which is actually true, which is grimly hilarious in the way that history should be. In any case, if you look at World War II propaganda, I recommend everyone should go and see this film. It's on YouTube. It's 17 minutes long. It's called Hitler Lives. It was made in 1945. It was directed by Don Siegel, who later directed Dirty Harry. And the script, although he's not credited as such, is by Dr. Seuss. And this is a piece of literally Dr. Seuss. And this is a piece of American war propaganda that's actually post-war. It's completely deranged. You learn when you watch Hitler Lives why Americans were fighting the war. And they were fighting the war. It was actually a race war against the eternal German and his eternal racial drive to conquer the earth, right? And straight up, this is absolutely what you're supposed to believe. Completely fucking lunacy, right? The Holocaust is not mentioned as such. Hitler is an equal opportunity baby killer. But this film is for 13-year-olds. And I was watching it about a month ago with a film guy, total film nerd, not really politically aware. And it's like, this film is 17 minutes long. It is not by until minute 13, at which point it starts talking about American politics, which is absolutely bananas. It is not until minute 13 that I convinced this guy that this film is not ironic. That it's actually straight up, that it's not intended as campy whatsoever, that people are just supposed to take this shit straight in, right? You know, because, you know, like, of course you see this today and you're like, my God, this is hilariously ham-handed propaganda. But you're watching that today with skills for handling propaganda that nobody had besides a tiny, tiny elite back then. The people who made the propaganda had these skills, abso-fucking-lutely, but they were not widely distributed among the population. Even, you know, go back to when I was a kid and watching the Super Bowl in the 80s, right? You know, I'm watching 80s TV, the Super Bowl would come on, and sometimes in the Super Bowl commercials, one of them would be ironic, right? You know, and that was like, wow, that was actually funny. And now it's like they basically all are, right? And so you're seeing this penetration of irony and imagination into the public mind. You take people to see a film like, so let's say, Inception came in like 2010 or something like that. You watch Inception, and it's this vast blockbuster, right? Show that film to audiences in 1960. They'd be like grabbing their heads like stunned monkeys. They would be like, this is the worst, most disturbing, disorienting experience I've ever had. I don't know how anyone could watch this. What the hell? What did you put in my popcorn? Right? You know, you watch that in 2010 and the audience is like, oh yeah, there's 3 levels of reality, and inside that one, and if you fall backward into the bathtub, you wake up. Like, you know, this whole sort of matrix way of thinking, of switching fluidly between worlds is very easy for people. Right. And that's what basically allows you to look at the situation and say, wait a second, maybe the next sort of seismic change in political power. And as you know, when you look at our sort of constitution, you have remember where we started with these series of republics, right? And it's like the San Andreas Fault. The whole thing breaks like every 75 or 80 years. And the way it breaks is you have a new regime that basically starts with a new president who's in practice a monarch. And the last one was 75 or 80 years ago. So kind of like, is this really where I want to buy the real estate? Yeah, actually. So the whole thing is sort of ready to fall into the sea, in this respect already, right? And then you look at it and you're like, the mechanism by which this happens next is going to take advantage of a sort of a seismic shift in the kind of talents and inclinations of Americans. And what do they have a talent for? What talent have they lost? They've lost the talents for virtue and sincerity and all these old good American, hardworking middle-class values. All that shit is totally blown out and gone, right? So if you're basically relying on the virtues of the hardworking American public, which basically survives by printing money and getting free shit from China and doing dope, forget it. If you're relying on if your political engine takes sincerity and virtue as fuel, it's not going to get very far. If it takes irony and imagination as fuel, it's going to go a lot farther than it ever would have gone before, right? And so, in a way, that's why I feel that whatever the next regime change is, instead of sort of being this massive act of like sincerity and sobriety, which is the way most libertarians are just as active, like being convinced of the truth in the marketplace of ideas, which is the way most people sort of in the Anglo-American libertarian conservative tradition see it. I think that we're much more likely to be looking at something which is much more like an immense act of imagination and irony, which is so immense that it's actually real. As of course Trump wasn't. And and this is the same theme I closed with my last Substack post, which is free, so you can definitely check it out. I'm like, the best thing that Trump did is Trump let people dream. We sort of dreamed this Trump who was something very other than what he was. I mean, that's what Trump is. He's a con man. He projects something that he isn't, and he projected this immense confidence and almost this kind of kingliness, and he's actually kind of this squalid little con artist, but he projects this dream, and people looked at it and they saw this dream and they're like, yeah, actually, I do like dreaming. I do want to dream. So maybe next time you'll like dream for real instead of like finding this like, cheeseball. With all due respect to very talented guy in many ways. I love the video of him dancing. You ever seen that one?
Yes, yeah. The YMCA. Yeah.
There's a lot of great tracks that's been said too. As long as you get the beats per minute right, it's beautiful. All right, are we done here? Any further questions?